Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stuart Jordan, and I'm here for Attitude Magazine today, and you're listening to Attitude's ADHD Experts. In this hour of ADHD Experts, we're going to be talking about weight loss and ADHD. Our guest today is Dr. Roberto Olivardia. He's a clinical psychologist and clinical instructor of psychology at Harvard Medical School, and he specializes in the treatment of ADHD, body dysmorphic disorder, BDD, and obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. And his topic today is Your ADHD Tested Weight Loss Guide, Take It Off, Keep It Off. Dr. Olivardia is co-author of The Adonis Complex, a book detailing the various manifestations of body image problems in men, and he maintains a private psychotherapy practice in Massachusetts. Dr. Olivardia, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's get going and turn it over to you, Dr. Olivardia.
Thank you, Stuart. It's always my pleasure. This is a topic that is of particular passion for me. The first time I remember speaking about this subject at the 2008 CHAD conference, it was met with a lot of very positive feedback from people who had been struggling with eating issues. And I come to this via the avenue of specializing in the treatment of eating disorders and would work with many men who had binge eating disorder or bulimia nervosa, who it turns out also had ADHD. And when the ADHD was treated, then the treatment of their eating disorder took on a whole new level, a whole new perspective. So before we talk about weight loss per se, I first want to just address why it can be difficult for people with ADHD just to simply even eat healthy. Because as we know, one of the most important things for weight loss is to eat, and to eat in a way that's very healthy and keeps people sort of feeling satiated without feeling that they're overeating. Now, there are lots of empirical studies that have been recently done over the last 5 years that have really looked at this relationship between ADHD and obesity, as well as eating disorders such as binge eating disorder or bulimia, which is where people binge and then compensate for that binge by either vomiting or laxative use or excessive exercise. Particularly, there are studies in gastric bypass clinics. People who are candidates for gastric bypass surgery have found an astoundingly high rate of ADHD. And interestingly, most of the time, the ADHD has been undiagnosed prior to that. But why this has very interesting implications is that even post-surgery, studies have found that those with ADHD tend to lose less weight or actually will gain the weight back. And after you have a procedure like that, gaining the weight back can actually have a lot of severe medical consequences. Now, when we think of ADHD, a lot of the time, particularly with the hyperactive subtype, people might say, well, wouldn't a kid or an adult who's hyperactive, wouldn't they be burning calories? Wouldn't their metabolism be super high? Well, researchers looked at this. In 2004, Holtkamp and his colleagues looked at this theory of whether hyperactivity actually protects people from obesity, and they actually found that the opposite was found. So of almost 100 ADHD males, that they found that their body mass index was significantly higher than their non-ADHD peers. And in fact, when they looked at people whose body mass index was over the 90th percentile, which is morbidly obese, you found higher rates of ADHD. So being hyperactive doesn't protect you from obesity. So clearly, this is an issue we have to pay attention to, and not only in terms of obesity, but in terms of psychiatric eating disorders like bulimia and binge eating disorder. My colleagues of mine at Harvard Medical School in 2007 did a study of ADHD girls and found that they were 4 times more likely to have an eating disorder, as well as in the University of Virginia in California found that bulimia was much more common amongst ADHD adolescent girls than their non-ADHD counterparts. So why would this be? Why are we seeing is very, very strong relationship. And these are very statistically significant findings. Well, when we understand ADHD, we actually can see that there are many different risk factors that could relate to why people have problems with eating and developing weight problems. From a cognitive perspective, if you think about healthy eating, it requires a very high level of executive functioning. You have to have good organization skills. You have to plan. When we eat, it's not the time that we want to eat that we have to start planning for that meal. We have to start planning for it at least a couple hours or at least an hour beforehand to make sure that meat is defrosted, that we have all the ingredients that we want. And it's very tough for people with ADHD to think in not now ways. So a lot of times, a lot of clients of mine who struggle with weight issues who have ADHD will say is that they think about dinner at the time their stomach is growling. And at that point, but even if you don't have ADHD, it's very difficult to think through making something. But particularly if you have ADHD, the impulsivity of eating is just going to override all of the executive demands that are necessary to plan a good meal. So that leads people to either skip meals or, in a lot of ways, to rely on heavy fat, heavy carb, fast foods, which then will satisfy them, but of course is not healthy. People with ADHD have issues with regulation and can have a lot of difficulties in observing themselves and observing their own bodies in terms of, are they satisfied? Are they full? Are they hungry? And it can be very difficult. I've worked with clients where one of the contributing factors to their being overweight is that they skip meals. And as we'll talk about later, that weight loss is not about eating less. It's about eating the right kinds of foods, and it's actually often about eating more than what people might think you need to be eating. Diet is not a word that we're going to be entertaining in this seminar. So if you skip a meal, your body will compensate for that by trying to eat more the next meal. So skipping meals can lend itself to overeating later in the day. Sleep habits. I gave a webinar here through Attitude a while ago on sleep issues. Sleep hygiene is essential for weight control. In fact, one of the best things you can do to manage your weight is to get a healthy night's sleep, and we could talk about that more later. So when we look at all these regulation factors, it's so important to understand that for people with ADD who often might eat while doing another activity, it's very easy to miss how much food one is actually consuming. Now, we know emotionally that there are a lot of emotional risk factors as well. All of us can relate to having a bad day and maybe coming home and having a little ice cream or a pint of ice cream and maybe overeating. For people with ADHD, this is much more heightened, and not just in terms of stress and anxiety or bad moods, but even if they're feeling happy, even if they're in a good mood, they want more of that good mood. Probably the most common emotional trigger I hear from my patients is boredom, that when they have too much unstructured time, which is often going to be at nighttime, and if you're a night owl, which many people with ADD are, so now you're not sleeping well, everyone else is asleep, and you're bored, food becomes an immediate gratification. And that could really set somebody up for ingesting a lot more calories than their body really requires, which of course leads to weight gain. But what I say to people is that it's extremely important for people to understand not to have shame about this and understand that those of us with ADHD, we are biologically wired for this issue with food, and it takes a lot more effort than it might for someone without ADD. There's fascinating biological and genetic research that looks at people with ADHD and how they are at higher risk for developing these kind of problems. Studies on brain scans find that the ADD brain is slower at absorbing glucose. The whole myth of sugar, for example, it is a myth that sugar causes ADHD or hyperactivity. However, people with ADHD often crave sugar and love sugar and often ingest sugar way beyond the point where they really should. So the ADD brain is almost wired to not get the signal quick enough that says, ooh, I've had too much sugar. So the body can ingest a lot more sugar before that shutoff point happens. And sugar helps stimulate levels of dopamine in the brain, which is very reinforcing for the ADD brain. The ADD brain is by nature an under-aroused brain. So we have all these various neurotransmitters and chemicals in our brain. One is dopamine, which is known as the reward center neurotransmitter. It's responsible for motivation. When we have a great feeling of something, levels of dopamine rise in the brain. Well, the ADD brain at baseline has very, very low levels of dopamine, insufficient levels of dopamine, which explains why people with ADHD are seeking stimulation in many different forms, one of which is food. Food is an immediate sense of stimulation that is medicating, basically, those low levels of dopamine. And of course, when you're talking about sugar, that's an even more immediate sense of rising those levels of dopamine. The ADD brain also is very low in another neurotransmitter called GABA, and GABA is responsible for inhibition. So if we have sufficient levels of GABA, we are able to inhibit certain impulses that we have. If you have low levels of GABA, you have lost some of those inhibitions. So when you have someone with ADHD that has low levels of GABA and low levels of dopamine, you're talking about a brain that is not inhibited and is very under-aroused. It's just it sets the stage for having an issue like this. Now, that doesn't mean it's hopeless, but what it does mean is that it's important, A, to understand the science so that you're aware of how important this is to work on, and B, not to beat yourself up if you're trying to engage in a meal plan and you sort of fall off the wagon, so to speak, or if it's very difficult for you to adhere to some of these strategies, to really be kind to yourself around this. Now, it's so important to even watch how we eat. There's a whole, in the eating disorder field, there's a lot of talk about mindfulness and mindful eating and intuitive eating, being aware of your body, being aware of how many times you chew your food. Are you putting food in your mouth before you swallowed whatever was in your mouth? And I do a lot of these exercises with patients in my office where we'll have a meal together and talk about these various things like, are you taking a deep breath before you eat? Or are you kind of approaching the dinner table in this sort of hyper state where you're not even having a full deep breath? Do you put your fork or spoon down after the food goes in your mouth? Which even doing a subtle tip like that can make a big difference in the amount of calories you take in. Because what you basically want is for your brain and your stomach to be in constant communication with each other. You don't want sort of a slow signal. You want the signal from your stomach that says, I'm satisfied, to go to your brain and vice versa. But if we eat too fast, that signal doesn't have enough time to get to the other place, which means we're going to be taking in a lot more food than our body really wants to. Try to eat as if you need to describe every aspect of the meal to someone who has never tasted that food before, which is an exercise I'll do with patients to really mindfully connect with your food, because food is a wonderful thing. Obviously, we need it to survive, but for a lot of us, including myself, it's very cultural. There are a lot of great meanings behind food and family and gatherings and social events around food. So it's important to have a very healthy relationship with food. Watch sort of, even while you're eating, how you're connecting to the food. So in looking at interventions and strategies is really incorporating some of these mindful eating components, but also being very aware of, are you treating sort of both the ADHD and the eating issue? And sometimes the eating issue is completely related to the ADHD, but making sure that if you're working with a therapist or a counselor that the ADHD is definitely looked at as a large component of this. But everything from behavioral scheduling, really structuring your days and particularly your nights, setting up alarms, reminders of, okay, it's time to eat or it's time to plan for eating. Sleep hygiene, incredibly important. Time management. And in terms of eating, is making sure that you're choosing foods not at the time that you're hungry, because when we're hungry, we are always we're gravitated, we're designed to want to eat high-fat foods when we're hungry, because our body is already in a starvation zone. Now, one of the things, and I'm sure people will ask about, is stimulant medication, can often, there's a lot of research, and in the eating disorder field, it was often seen as contraindicated to prescribe stimulants to someone with an eating disorder because it can suppress the appetite. However, those with ADHD, the studies are been found that those who take stimulants, that it doesn't suppress the appetite in an unhealthy way, it actually regulates their eating. So studies have shown that those with ADHD who choose to take stimulant medication and also have eating issues find that it can significantly help with their eating as well as weight loss goals because their executive functions are that much more improved. But not everybody, if people choose not to take a stimulant, it doesn't mean that there aren't behavioral approaches, some of which I've mentioned, but also just nutritionally. First and foremost, never skip breakfast. Breakfast really is the most important meal of the day. It sets up your metabolism for the day. Try to have a lot of protein in that breakfast. Protein is a very sustaining nutrient in the body. It doesn't peak and have this crash like sugar does, for example. Really engaging in a lot of foods that are going to sort of fill you and be very satisfying. Your fish and your chickens and high protein snacks like eggs and nuts. Stay away from the sort of less simple carbohydrates, anything with corn syrup in it, and gravitate towards your vegetables and fruits. And foods that are very rich in omega-3 fatty acids like tuna and olive oil is actually very good. And there are some preliminary studies that have looked at eating, making sure that the ADHD body and brain is getting enough zinc and iron. Perhaps there's deficiencies. But first and foremost, what's so important is really addressing any shame that somebody might have. Working with patients with eating disorders for almost 20 years, there's such a marked degree of shame around this issue. And for people with ADHD who struggle with their weight and who struggle with eating, a lot of shame, because eating is an everyday thing. It's something that we all have to do, and everybody does 3 to 4 times a day. And I think it can feel particularly shameful for people with ADHD to say to themselves, why is it that something that is just comes so naturally to everybody else is so difficult for me? And we're reminded of that multiple times a day. It's not like, a project, let's say, that we procrastinate on, which we could kind of avoid, and until the end of the week, let's say. With eating, we have to deal with it every single day, multiple times a day. And so it's important to just be compassionate with yourself and understand that there is a predisposition here that does make it harder. But once you can understand that, engage with strategies that are ADHD friendly, then there's no question that you can do very well in terms of healthy eating and achieving healthy weight loss. So I'm open for any questions that people have.
Great, Dr. Olivardia. Thank you for the intro, and we have a number of questions that are coming in. Plus, we also had a couple that were submitted in advance to the website, and I thought I would start there. Person writes in that they're well-versed in portion control, nutrition, good fats, bad fats, and still, comment writes, I stuff my face whenever I get the chance. I haven't seen anyone address the real issue as I see it, food addiction. Can you talk about how you come to grips with and deal with food addiction as opposed to, and the problems that causes?
Absolutely. I absolutely believe in the entity of a food addiction. Some people think it's sort of one of these fad terms, although it's not a formal diagnosis in the DSM. But absolutely, that there are people that have addiction issues to food. And in fact, I've treated many people with ADHD who, when they recovered from a drug addiction or alcohol addiction and were sober, developed a food addiction. So it's always important for people who might be recovering from one addiction to be very, very mindful of another one potentially creeping up. For people who have those kind of issues, it's very important, one, to always make sure that you're carrying sort of high protein, kind of healthy snacks with you so that you're not sort of in the most vulnerable position someone who has food addiction issues could be, is to really to have their stomach be growling, to really be hungry, because at that point everything is sort of out the window. So if, let's say, if you're going to a Memorial Day barbecue and you know that that there's going to be lots of food there, and that's a very high triggering situation for you. Eat something healthy before you go, literally like 20 minutes before you go. So when you get there, you'll probably still eat something, but you may not have the same sort of capacity to eat as much as you would have before, nor the desire to. Chewing gum, which sometimes can stimulate appetite in people, but for other people becomes a good way of sort of keeping their mouth occupied so that they don't sort of put food in it. It's sort of what we call a habit reversal technique in behavioral therapy. But being just like any addict, being very aware of what are your trigger situations. So clients of mine who have food addiction issues would never go to a buffet, for example. Buffets are just completely off the list. And one doesn't have to go to a buffet. There are most restaurants don't have buffets. But that is equivalent to an alcoholic going to a bar. I mean, it's just way too tempting. And even for the average person, buffets, people tend to completely overeat. So watch your trigger situations, be very aware of them, think of, even if it's 2 or 3 things that you're going to do to sort of offset that in some way. If you have a trusted friend or a trusted loved one that's going to be with you in that situation, to ask them if they could not sort of be your parent, but to just gently remind you. If there's some signal, maybe a word that they can say, so it's not shaming. You don't want people to say, don't eat that. Do you really want to eat that? That brings up a lot of bad feelings for people, but maybe if there's a code word, like beach or something totally random that just helps that person in that moment say, okay, positioning yourself. If you're at a party, even when you're in conversation, position yourself so your back is facing the food, so you're not staring at it. Many people with ADHD are on the quote-unquote seafood diet. If they see it, they're going to eat it, even if they've just eaten a meal. So being very honest with yourself is essential.
Great. And one question that came up, that's maybe a follow-up on that, is self-discipline an executive function?
Yes, I mean, all of the things that would go into what we call self-discipline, absolutely, because in some ways, to have discipline over something, we may be inhibiting certain things. So, for example, for somebody who is who wants to eat something, who wants to eat another piece of cheesecake but does not, means that they're able to have certain inhibitory responses that tell them, okay, that they're able to think through perhaps, I might want this right now, but I can think through ahead of how I might feel later on tonight. People with ADHD have a very hard time with that. Russell Barkley, who's the world's leading researcher on ADHD, says that people with ADHD suffer from time blindness, meaning that they're only thinking in literally what's in front of them in that moment. So it is an executive function to be able to move out of that moment in time to then project yourself into a future point in time to say, I might like this right now, but I'm going to regret it later. And similarly, that's also for positive behaviors like working out. I always tell my patients, I don't ever look forward to going to the gym. I'm just not one of those people that says, oh, I can't wait to get to the gym. You'll meet people like that, and you wonder, they're just a different species than I am. However, what I have trained myself to do is to put myself in the future in terms of how I feel after I work out. And every time after I work out, I always feel better. I have never regretted working out when I have gone to the gym. So that's what motivates me to get to the gym. There's nothing in me that is motivated by, I want to go. What I almost have to kind of keep myself in this sort of zone of how I'm going to feel afterwards. So yes, there are a lot of executive functions that are involved in what we call discipline, or when people use the word willpower, which I'm not a fan of that word, because people with ADHD, they have the will. It's not that they don't have the will. It's, as we know with ADHD, it's the intentions don't always get realized. But I think that word, when people aren't able to sort of execute the goal that they wanted to, they end up feeling like they are disempowered, and we're not disempowered. What we need to do more as people with ADHD is to just be more strategic.
Okay. We've got a variety of questions that all fall into the area of supplements. So why don't we address a few of these? One of the questions is, are there specific supplements like zinc or iron that would help, that would help with dealing with cravings?
There isn't a particular supplement that, in terms of foods, probably protein is going to be your best bet nutritionally. That the more protein you can integrate in your diet, as long as you're not binging on protein, because too much of anything is not going to be good. But protein is a very sustaining nutrient in the body. So you can have protein, even if it's something that is a little higher in fat, like red meat might have a high degree of fat, but it has a high degree of protein. That's going to be a better food for you than a lower fat, no protein food, because you'll eat that, and yes, it might have less calories, it might have less fat, but then you're going to be hungry 15 minutes later. Whereas you eat something that's very rich in protein and iron, it's going to sustain longer in the body. Now, when we're talking about supplements, I also want to caution people. First of all, and of course with any of this, always consult your primary care physician to see how this integrates your overall medical profile, because of course everybody's different. But generally a multivitamin a day is going to do the trick in terms of just supplementing a lot of the foods that you'll be eating. It's a good way to start the day. Again, I would check with your doctor to just make sure that that works in your particular case. But when we're talking about weight loss supplements, there's a billion-dollar supplement industry out there, and a lot of it is around weight loss. And for a lot of the men that I work with, around weight or muscle gain, sort of burning fat, gaining muscle. And it's important for people to know that most, if not all, of these supplements that are sold in these stores are not regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. So you and I could take dirt from our backyard, put it in a capsule, and as long as we say it has not been evaluated by the FDA, so basically, take at your own risk, it's completely legal. And some of these supplements that so-called lose weight do achieve that goal of helping people lose weight. The problem is that it causes a whole host of medical consequences in some cases, and it doesn't have any goal in terms of helping the person keep the weight off. No product that is going to make you lose 20 pounds in a month is healthy for you. And this is it can be frustrating for people, especially a group of people, like people with ADHD, who are very instant gratifying individuals. We're impatient by nature. So it's very tough, again, that time blindness to see the process in this. But for the average male who is overweight, every week, if you're losing about 2 pounds a week, then the chances of you keeping that weight off are very good. For women, it's about 1 pound a week. So if you're someone who wants to lose 50 pounds, if you're very overweight and you want to lose 50 pounds, at minimum, it will take a man about 6 months to do that. And for a woman, about a year. And people don't like to hear that. People want to hear, no, I want it faster. So you have these products that are out there that really prey particularly on the ADD population, because we are instant gratifiers. And so it's very important, please, I caution people, do not buy any product that proposes to do that. It really does come down to eating well, having physical activity, and sleeping, which is another thing that is often not talked enough about, the important role of sleep in weight regulation.
Following up on this question about supplements and ADHD medication, are there any concerns about specific contraindications between the ADHD medication and the supplement?
Well, when we're talking about vitamin supplements, I'm not aware of anything in terms of your iron, your magnesium, your zinc, omega-3 fatty acids. They tend to actually complement oftentimes what stimulants do. If we're talking about these sort of quote-unquote weight loss supplements that are sold in these quote-unquote natural food stores, there are massive contraindications because some of these products that are fat burners and products like that are basically kind of synthetic forms of amphetamines and absolutely can be contraindicated because if they could dehydrate people, they could speed up people's metabolism only by speeding their heart rate up. And with stimulant medication, there absolutely could be contraindications. The problem is that because these products are fairly new on the market, we're talking in the last 15 years or so, and many years ago, I mean, when I wrote a book years ago about body image issues in men, and in the course of writing that book in the late 90s, there were 3 deaths in the U.S. of boys who had taken a product called ephedrine, which is now illegal, but was sold at these natural food stores as a supplement to burn fat. And these boys happened to be athletes who were looking to cut fat very quickly, and they had heart attacks. So be very, very just stay away from those products. But absolutely, anytime you're taking anything, absolutely run it through and run it by your psychopharmacologist to just say, does this have any contraindications? And they will be able to definitely tell you.
Okay, great. And one last question in the supplement area. Someone asked, can you supplement GABA to improve inhibition?
It's a good question. I don't know. I think that certainly anytime we have foods that are rich in stimulating neurotransmitters, that absolutely, that it can potentially mitigate some of the effects of that. So it's to what extent we don't know 100% yet, because again, how all of these things get metabolized is very different per individual. But I'm sure that there's going to be more research and looking at sort of having things like GABA and things like that people could use to help them with if they have issues with inhibition or lack thereof.
Okay. Someone asks, there are a number of questions about focus and motivation, and specifically as it deals with ADD in terms of, are there any specific suggestions that you could make about meal planning or for individual or families with ADD present?
Absolutely. I think, what's important is really trying to find what's going to work for you specifically. As we know, with ADHD, you can have 10 people with ADHD in a room and they all respond to very different things. So as in my role, what I try to do is really just be as creative as I can with patients. And so if this is something you're working with a professional about, this is why it's essential that they understand the ADHD. So to give you examples, I have clients who use various apps where they might plan their meals, let's say, for the day. And if they're websites, for example, of recipes, and will automatically put into your phone the ingredients that are needed on that recipe, and you can sort of check whether you have them or don't have them, and it generates a grocery list for you. I have a number of individuals who will, within session together or with a nutritionist, will plan out kind of their meals for the week, or just have certain staples in their house. That's sort of another thing, is being very honest of what are the foods that I probably shouldn't have too much of in the house because I might just end up overeating them. Like Oreo cookies are one of those things for me where I love Oreo cookies, and if I have an entire package of them, they'll be gone in 48 hours, easy. But I don't deprive myself of the Oreo cookie. I'll get the small package of them. And that's important as well, as the idea of dieting or restricting food is a very tricky thing, because oftentimes it's going to lead people to crave that food even more. Sometimes, having regularly scheduled or structured things, whether it's Weight Watchers for some people or whether it's talking to a friend about it, writing it out. I have a patient that has a whiteboard, a dry erase whiteboard in their kitchen, and on Sunday night, they blast some music, and for about 20 minutes, they write down what they're going to eat. And it becomes a good way of just putting yourself in the future and really unburdening yourself. Because if you think about it, it is very stressful to think about, what am I going to eat today? What am I going to prepare? And if you're a parent who's also cooking for your children, that's even more stressful. So I am a big proponent of having a period of time, whether it's Sunday tends to be a good day for many people where they're not working and such, and with less than an hour where you're basically committing to meal planning for the entire week. And that way you can also generate a grocery list of anything that you need for any of those meals in the week, and either on the Sunday go food shopping or Monday, whenever people typically do their food shopping. And then in addition, when you go to the supermarket, always go with a list and never go to the supermarket hungry, because you will buy foods that are higher in fat, higher in sugar, higher in simple carbs if your stomach is growling. And of course, exercise is another very important component of weight loss. But of the two, I always tell people it's very, very important, if you're looking for weight loss, is to focus on the food, because it's amazing how one meal or a portion of a meal could easily undo the caloric burn of an hour workout. So if for a number of my patients who are like, oh, I don't want to, I have to watch what I eat and I have to exercise, like, oh, it's too overwhelming, and then they kind of have a very all or nothing approach, I tell people, don't worry about the exercise right now. Let's focus on the eating. And then what happens to a lot of my patients is when they do lose weight, they're more motivated to walk more. It's not as hard to physically move their bodies. But that's important, because if you're on the treadmill, for an hour, you can get off there and you're sweating, and it feels like you sweat off 10 pounds. And then your weekly weigh-in or whatnot, you're like, oh my gosh, how come I haven't lost weight? Well, one Big Mac could easily undo an hour on the treadmill. I mean, food, we have to be very mindful of that. What I also recommend to people, if you go out to eat in restaurants, try to limit either the going out to eat in general, because most restaurants are not invested in feeding you healthily. They're invested in having you buy their food. And what's going to get you back is more often than not that you think the food tastes good. And it's going to taste good because it's loaded with fat and with butter and with sugar and with salt. Look on the restaurant's websites for chains. They post nutritional information. Very, very important. So all of these things, trying to sort of think outside the box and be creative of using different modalities that sort of keep you on track. I recommend people weigh themselves once a week, no more than that though, because we don't want this to be a compulsion. We don't want it to develop into an eating disorder, but at the same time, it is important to be mindful of your weight and mindful of, I gained 3 pounds this week, and not as an opportunity to beat yourself up, but more to look at it as, oh, well, actually, now that I think of it, I skipped lunch those 2 days and I ate a lot at dinner. Okay, now this is something I'm going to work on next week. And then likewise, you might find in a week that you lost 3 pounds, that you might say, wow, actually, you know what? I slept really well this week. So, and it's looking at it as like data collection. And everybody will have a different, for some of my patients, their sleep hygiene is the most important thing for them in terms of regulating weight. For other people, it's making sure that they don't skip a meal. And part of not skipping a meal is making sure that they're adequately planning so that they're not overwhelmed at the time of meals. So it can be different for different people.
Okay, thanks. We have a series of questions from people asking about sleep and weight loss and trying to understand the connection and how to manage it. Do you want to go into that a little bit more?
Absolutely. So basically, if we think about what our body really, really needs to survive, we need to eat, we need to drink water, and we need to sleep. If we don't do one of those things, our bodies will severely be compromised, and we're basically, bringing on our own mortality. So when our bodies don't sleep, our brain doesn't understand. If you have to think of, almost think of it as when we're cavemen and cavewomen, our brain doesn't understand that we're choosing not to go to sleep. Our brain is functioning on a very evolutionary cycle of keeping us alive. So our brain thinks, well, if I'm not going to sleep, which is a pretty important survival technique, it must mean that one of the other two mechanisms are threatened. And if one of them is threatened, then this makes sense. So if the body doesn't sleep, the brain and the body are assuming that it must mean that you need some food. And so it's going to do a couple things. It may actually give you a second wind so that you could get the energy to get to a food supply. And again, our brain doesn't understand that the food could be right in front of you. It's just operating on the same sort of mechanisms as was operating 1,000 years ago. So it's going to give you a second wind to look for food supply. But also what happens is that your body now, because it feels that it's potentially going to be starved soon, it's going to do a couple things. It's going to regulate hormones in your body. One is ghrelin and the other is leptin. And what these two hormones do is regulate how full and satisfied you are and your cravings for certain foods. And when we don't sleep, immediately, I mean, this happens over even one night of sleep deprivation, your levels start altering of leptin and ghrelin, which means your metabolism starts slowing, so the amount of calories you burn, and we actually burn a lot of calories while we are sleeping. Believe it or not, I remember reading a statistic years ago that said we're burning more calories when we're sleeping than when we're watching television. So if you are sitting watching television, your body is actually truly less active than when we're sleeping. A lot is happening when we're sleeping. So when you sleep, or rather when we don't sleep, our bodies are going to lower their metabolism, and it's going to increase cravings for fat because our body wants to survive. So literally, our sense of smell, our taste buds are all sort of working at changing to bring us to higher fattening foods. And so when we think about, for people who binge or people who overeat, and certainly my patients who have binge eating disorder, none of them binge on broccoli. I mean, I've never worked with someone who's binged on vegetables. What people tend to binge on are high carb, high sugar, high fattening foods, your pizza, your potato chips, your ice cream. And then if you are eating, so now if you're not sleeping, now your metabolism is dropping, you're craving fat, and now let's say you hit the refrigerator at 1, 2 in the morning, and you're eating foods that are high in fat, it's like a double whammy because now you're eating these high-fattening foods at a time when your metabolism is looking to burn no calories. So you are holding and storing like hibernation, like a bear that's hibernating. And that cycle can be very, very vicious. And then, of course, if you overeat or if you eat at 2 in the morning and you're supposed to wake up at 7, you might not be hungry for breakfast. You skip breakfast, but then the problem is it just sets off the cycle. So when I have, and I also tell patients ADHD and sleep disorders go hand in hand, sleep apnea, narcolepsy, you name it, very, very prevalent in the ADHD population. And I know from my own personal experience with sleep apnea that the first month that I used the CPAP, which I have to use for the rest of my life because my sleep apnea is very anatomically driven, that without doing anything except just sleeping more and sleeping with the CPAP, which guarantees that I'm getting sufficient levels of oxygen, I lost 12 pounds in a month. And I've heard many stories of that with patients who just by sleeping better, they just wake up, you just have more energy, which means that your executive functions are going to be better, which means you're going to be better at planning and time management and all those other things. I mean, just all the regular things we know about sleep deprivation. You're not as cognitively clear if you don't sleep well. Your information processing part of your brain is not working as well because we process a lot and consolidate information during REM sleep, which is a stage where we dream. It's not only that we're dreaming, it's almost like our brain is in a kind of for people who might be familiar with what defragmentation is in computers, it's sort of taking bits of data and kind of synthesizing them. That's what's happening during REM sleep. So our ability to be information processors, to be cognitively clear, all better with sleep, but also biologically, hormonally, not a good thing when we are sleep deprived. It is actually one of the contributing factors to obesity is sleep debt, especially in children.
And so I'm assuming that if someone with ADD who is experiencing sleep issues, that one of the top priorities for them should be to try and deal with the sleep disorder, because it will have a carryover effect in terms of weight issues and all of any other problems they may have. True?
Absolutely, absolutely. And for people who have real serious sleep issues, get a sleep study. It can literally change your life. I mean, something like sleep apnea could be a life-threatening disorder. I mean, it's not just someone who's snoring a lot. It means your heart is working at a rate that it really shouldn't be working at. It's equivalent to suffocating in your sleep. So these are very serious issues. But in addition to, it's important to let people know that for people who are exercising and are saying, how come I'm not losing weight? A lot of my ADD patients will say, I go to the gym 5-6 times a week. Well, when you're let's say if you're on a treadmill or an elliptical and it tells you the number of calories that you're burning and all the data, that data you have to assume is only accurate if all other things are sort of taken care of, which means if you are eating a consistent level of food throughout the day and if you're sleeping well. If those things are not happening, those numbers are not accurate. So you could be on a treadmill for an hour, but if your metabolism has dropped to nothing, then you're not burning the number of calories that it's saying. Those number of calories or the number is often generated by what the average sort of person of a certain, age or weight or whatnot and speed, all of that is sort of calculated. So if you're not sleeping, this was a patient who was sleeping 3 hours a night. And I said, you're not going to lose weight. Your body's holding on to that because if you're sleeping only 3 hours a night, your body needs that energy to keep yourself awake. It assumes that if you're not sleeping, it's because you can't be sleeping. Like there's something more important that needs to get done. And to the ADD brain, that's what it feels like for many people. It's very tough for them to go to sleep because they're like, oh, I have to do this and I have to do this, and their focus and their hyper-focus is so much better. Or for some people, they just have a very hard time getting to sleep. But absolutely dealing with the sleep issues are so important.
Now, someone just asked, if you don't have a sleep disorder but you have problems getting to sleep, are over-the-counter or prescription sleep aids a good thing or a bad thing? Do they give you the same type of sleep that you're looking for?
It's a good question. I mean, I always caution in telling people, of course, work with your doctor, work with someone who, either your coach or your therapist around the ADHD, to first rule out if there's anything on a behavioral level that you could be doing, because you don't want to be adding something. Some of these sleep medications could be habit forming. They could result in issues with REM sleep. I mean, there are side effects, to some of them. But for some people, it works beautifully, or certain medications might work very helpful. And at the end of the day, if you're not sleeping, it's better to take something to help you get a night's sleep, because the effects and the consequences of particularly prolonged sleep deprivation, it can make people psychotic. I mean, it can really get people into a very, very bad place. But I wouldn't use that as a first-line approach. I would make sure, are you basically adequately getting your body and your brain ready for bed? Are you dimming the lights? Are you engaging in sort of more calm activities before sleeping? Are you not eating a full meal before you plan on going, to sleep? For people who take stimulant medications, sometimes they take a dose right before bed, and that actually helps them fall asleep because they're able to focus more on getting to sleep. Exercise, it varies. I'm a night exercise person. I prefer to work out, and I could work out at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. There's a 24-hour gym near my work. And that's when I do a vigorous workout. I come home, I take a shower, and I will get to bed earlier and sleep better that night. For other people, it will completely stimulate and wake them up. So you have to sort of look at, again, how it's affecting you. But if all of those things are failing, or, again, if the consequences of the sleep deprivation are so high, absolutely talk to your doctor about a sleep aid, but monitor it, and don't just sort of take it for face value. Monitor, are you developing tolerance for it? Are there side effects to it? But I just tell people with something like sleep, you don't want it to just be the medication. You have to make sure you're addressing it behaviorally as well.
Great. I want to go back. You mentioned binge eating before, and we had someone who submitted a question specifically about the incidence of binge eating as it relates to ADHD medications, and that what happens is when the medication's wearing off, the binge eating kicks in. Any suggestions on how to manage that?
Absolutely. That is, as I mentioned, and in fact, just recently, as recently as a week ago, there's studies that are showing how Vyvanse, which is a medication for ADHD, is going to be tested as a trial for patients with binge eating disorder. That there's very preliminary studies that have found that patients who do not have ADHD but just have binge eating disorder are significantly helped with Vyvanse. So there is definitely something about how stimulants can be very helpful in reducing impulsivity. But the question is absolutely true that if for people, when their medication wears off, they may find that they now have just more impulsivity and less inhibition. And again, it's often, if it's going to wear off, it's often going to wear off in the evening or the nighttime, which is almost the toughest part of the day to regulate eating, and for people who overeat or have weight issues, because there's a lot less structure. So incredibly important to make sure, again, that you're having foods that are very rich in protein, trying not to have trigger foods that are around you. And again, it's not about deprivation, because I'm very specific about this in terms of it's not about, because it's very easy for people to get into, oh, I don't deserve to have an Oreo cookie. We don't want that kind of thinking. But what we do want is, I know I'll eat the whole package of Oreos. So I'm not going to bring the whole package in my house, but I'll bring the little, 4 Oreo package in the house, and that could be sort of my treat. But really trying to structure your time, almost planning for it, anticipating what time of day does the medication wear off? When do you notice that impulsivity coming in more? And then when you can plan for it, it's not hitting you by surprise. You're not sort of taken over by it. If you can anticipate, okay, 6 o'clock, that's sort of when those munchies really start coming in. At 5 o'clock, maybe you can eat something that's very high in protein to help sort of mitigate some of that. You can think, okay, at 6 o'clock, maybe there's an activity that I could do or get myself involved in that I could even hyper-focus on, so that I'm not turning to food as a way of gratifying something. Or connecting yourself with other people, having, going for a walk with your spouse, or telling your child that you'll help them with their math homework at that time, and trying to fill that up with activities so that you're not vulnerable. Because that's the most important thing. With all the data that I presented around how the ADD brain is predisposed towards obesity, is not to disempower people. It's the total opposite. Like, I feel validated when I read that research, because one, it explains why these things can be so hard, but two, it now is empowering, because once I can understand that and accept it, then I could be honest with myself and saying, okay, this is what I need to do. A lot of other people don't need to do this, but this is what I need to do, and that's okay. It doesn't make me defective. It doesn't make me, not have willpower, because the other reason I don't like that word is that it's very easy to say, oh, that person has so much willpower. They go to the gym every day, and well, they may be wired in a completely different way than you are. So, like, I'm somebody, I don't drink alcohol, and I don't have any moral objection, to casual drinking of alcohol, but my body doesn't tolerate it, like, at all. And I get very sick. I don't like the taste of it. I think it's repulsive. And so I would never be an alcoholic, but not because I have willpower. It's because I'm just not wired towards that. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not wired towards other addictive behaviors or substances, but alcohol is certainly not one of them. So it's important for people to understand that it's to not denigrate themselves or shame themselves that they're just not cutting it. It's more that you're wired a certain way, and what the good news is that we have a body of research that explains that wiring, and we have to use that to develop strategies.
Great. We're running out of time, so one last question that represents a couple of queries that have come in, and it comes from parents of children with ADHD and eating issues. And the question specifically is what are the recommendations in terms of how to manage or trying to appropriately parent the child in terms of the eating and eating habits and management as opposed to doing it for oneself. Any last thoughts on that?
Sure. If you are a parent that has children with ADHD, or if you are a parent with ADHD that likely will have children with ADHD, it's important to make sure you're taking care of yourself as well as, being aware of your children. Just like in an airport, we're always taught to put the mask over ourselves before helping a child. And the same is true with healthy eating, that if you're not incorporating these skills in your own life, if you have ADHD, but yet you're sort of putting that energy in your kids, I mean, they're seeing that. And if they have ADHD, they likely will have the same tendency. So it's something that you can all talk about, too, as a family, and encourage children, particularly at a young age, to be mindful of, are we eating, do we chew our food just twice before we swallow it, or we chew it 4 or 5 times? Are we really feeling the flavor? Are we connecting to the food? It can start very young, where you start to sort of engage in very sort of mindful eating techniques that already implicit in that is helping somebody become more aware and therefore less impulsive about their food. Many ADHD kids are also very picky eaters, and so parents can be very frustrated with their kids only literally eating 3 foods. That could be a whole other webinar, but there is a lot of sort of tactile defensiveness and sensory defensiveness that a lot of kids with ADHD and a lot of adults with ADHD might have around certain textures and flavors and things like that. So it's important that if you find yourself very frustrated, get some support, work with a nutritionist, particularly ones that have experience with individuals with ADHD that can really help you. Don't feel like you have to do this all on your own.
Great. Thank you. The hour is up. It just flew by. Thank you for everybody with all of your questions. Thank you, Dr. Olivardia, for your time and sharing so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. My pleasure.
Everyone, have a very good day.
For more Attitude Podcast and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.